Welcome to Canada Files. I'm Valerie Pringle. My guest today is Katharine Hayhoe, who is a professor at Texas Tech University. She is also chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, a UN champion of the earth, and named one of Time's 100 most influential people. She's an evangelical Christian who has written the bestseller, Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. It's been called one of the most important books about climate change. Hello, Katharine.
Hi, Valerie.
This is your mission. I mean, Scientific American calls you heroic. What makes you think that you can get through to people on climate change?
Well, I don't think I can. I think all of us can together. Science has showed that the most effective messenger to have conversations about why climate change matters and what we can do about it are people that we know, friends and family. So I see my job as helping everyone else have those conversations with the people they love.
Well, when did you have this epiphany that the greatest solution was getting people to talk about it?
Well, I'm a physical scientist. I study the physics of the climate system. And after a decade or more of studying just how serious this problem of climate change was, just how urgent action was, and just how little was happening, I realized there has to be more. There's something we're not doing. We've been telling people it's real, it's bad, it's us, we need to fix it, and nothing is happening. Why not? So I looked at the social science. And back then, there wasn't a lot of social science around how people were making decisions about climate change. But I found one of my colleagues who was studying people's attitudes and perspectives, and I literally, that was back in the day, called him up on the phone and I said, Ed, I need to know everything that you know about why people aren't acting on climate. And so that was the beginning of my journey into understanding the barriers that prevent us from connecting what I now think of as our head to our heart to our hands. We know it's bad, we know it's serious, but we don't understand how it matters to me where I live, and we don't know what I can do about it. And when you look at the data shows most Canadians and even most Americans are worried about climate change, but they feel helpless and hopeless and don't know what to do, and only a fraction of us are activated. What's the missing piece? Talking about it.
But you then, I guess, had to, because you are, as you say, you're a scientist, atmospheric scientist, you study the effects of climate change on energy and food and working at the local level. I mean, you do research and for a lot of really important organizations, but you had to sort of go, oh, well, I guess I'm going to have to be the climate communicator.
I realized that you could be doing the best science in the world, but if people don't understand why it matters, then what's the point? And what helped me in this epiphany was, ironically, moving to Texas. So, growing up in Canada, I had the perspective that the grass is green, the sky is blue, and climate is changing due to human activities. But moving to Texas, where we moved for my husband's job originally, I realized that there were a lot of people there who didn't think that was the case. And they were curious. And they wanted to know why I would be doing something like dedicating my life to studying this issue. And so having conversations with them actually helped me see what the barriers are. And it turns out it's nothing to do with intelligence or education. It's everything to do with identity and values, which is not what you typically talk about in a physics classroom.
No, and when talking about your identity and values, I mean, you're an evangelical Christian and a scientist, and some people perceive that as, something that doesn't go together.
It's often perceived that way, but if you believe that God, in some shape or form, created this incredible universe that we live in, then what is science other than trying to figure out how he did it? So I grew up with this from an early age. My dad was a science teacher. He was actually the science coordinator for the Toronto Board of Ed. And so I grew up with the idea that faith and science are just two sides of the coin. But I had never really integrated it into my life until, being in Texas, I started to get invited to speak to local groups, a book club, the Senior Citizens Home, a women's organization. And then I got invited to speak at a church. They didn't know I was a Christian because I'd never talked about it. Why would I? I sort of had the idea of science and faith are two sides of the coin, but you only see one side at a time. But I had been talking with enough people that I knew that people were saying, well, obviously you care about this because you're a scientist, but why should I care about it? And going to this church, it was a Baptist church, so I knew that people probably cared for the same reason I did. So that was the very first time that I very nervously started to share with people why I cared. And the reaction that people had was so radically different in terms of, you could just see in people's body language how they were leaning forward and nodding and recognizing themselves in this concern. They were making that head-to-heart connection. That made me realize the power of connecting over shared values.
I still have a hard time understanding how. As you know, you've said the thermostat reads the same whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. How has it become so full of, bitterness and hatred?
Well, what's happening is in the US, society is now more politically polarized and has been for the last 10 years than any time since the Civil War. And now there's this really interesting institute called Beyond Conflict. They studied the situation in Northern Ireland back in the 70s. They were working with communities during apartheid in South Africa. Now they're focusing on the United States because that's the place where they see the biggest conflict. And they say that in the US, people now view others as enemies if they belong to the other party, not even as fellow humans or fellow citizens. And so climate change is a casualty of that polarization that sadly we see spreading to Canada as well.
But, it's science. There are facts. I mean, why is it political?
Well, I can tell you that. So we scientists have known since the 1800s that digging up and burning coal back then and oil and gas today produces heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around our planet. We've known that since the 1850s. So when did all this denial emerge? It did not emerge until the 1990s. That was more than 100 years after the science had pretty much been resolved. Why did it emerge in the 1990s? It's because that is when climate change was moving from a future distant issue that you could worry about in the future, you didn't have to do anything about it now, to something that was happening today. And if it's happening today, it means we have to do something about it. And almost 80% of the extra blanket we're wrapping around our planet comes from digging up, processing, and burning fossil fuels and other industrial practices. So the industry that was primarily responsible for it, they knew all about it because they had had scientists studying this for decades. And they said, well, we know that we could transition off fossil fuels, but that would certainly hurt the quarterly and annual returns. Or we could take a leaf from the tobacco industry's book, because the tobacco industry actually has some very well-trained spin doctors who've been spinning their message for a number of years, and some of them are out of work at the moment. We could just hire them on and get them to spin it for us, and that's what they did. So the denial was deliberately manufactured in the 1990s.
By the oil and gas industry.
By the oil and gas industry, and through their connections with politics in the US, it has become an incredibly politically polarized issue where the number one reason that you say climate is or isn't changing is simply where you fall on the political spectrum.
Yeah, but what good is it going to do the Republicans or anybody, political party, that's denying the reality of climate change and the importance of pricing carbon and weaning off oil and gas?
You can say I don't believe in gravity, but if you step off the cliff, you're still going down. And that's the problem, and that's why I think it's so important to begin these conversations with something that we have in common.
Your dad, is a science teacher, also a pastor, and for a time he took your family on a mission to Colombia, so you lived there for a while. What impact did that experience have on you?
Well, growing up in Colombia, we moved there when I was 9 years old. In the 1980s, and it had a profound impact on me in many ways. It gives you a different perspective on how much we have in common, as well as the few things that really divide us. It gave me a new perspective, even as a child, on what it looks like when the rains come, and the floods come, and the disasters occur, and you literally don't have the insurance, you don't have the resources to feed your family. You don't even have a safe place to live if the rains have washed away your home. And so then when I came back to Toronto and I was going to university here at University of Toronto, I was studying physics and astronomy. I was planning to be an astronomer. But I needed an extra class to finish my degree, and I looked around and there was this brand new class over in the geography department offered by a guy called Danny Harvey, who is still there, and it was on climate change. I thought, well, that looks interesting, why not take it? And at the time, I had the perspective that many of us, until recently, have still had, that climate change is a future issue. It will affect people and plants and animals in the future, and David Suzuki is working on it, and we can support his efforts and he'll fix it. That was sort of the perspective I had. But I took this class and I was completely astonished to learn that climate change already at that time was no longer a future issue. It was already happening today, already affecting real people and places today. And what really impacted me was when I learned that climate change affects us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally. People who are already marginalized, who are already living on the edges of society, whether it's people who don't have a home who are living on the streets of Halifax, or whether it's a subsistence farmer in Malawi who, when the crops fail, has to choose between selling a daughter into marriage at age 10 or 12 versus the entire family not being able to eat. Those who are already living on the edge are most affected, and that's not fair. And so combining my faith with seeing what that looked like as a child firsthand, with the fact that I could actually do something about this. I had the skill set to do this, sort of serendipitously. It turns out that physics is exactly the right background you need for climate modeling. I didn't know that. That's what led me to become a climate scientist.
Let's look at your example in terms of your carbon footprint. And you say you've measured yours and you're around 5, which is less than the Canadian-US average, which is about 8, because Canadians and Americans are pretty terrible.
I think that mine, when I first measured it, was the equivalent of 5 Earths you would need to support my life. Isn't that terrible? That is, I mean, it's just appalling. When we think about the injustice of a few of us, relatively speaking, hogging up, and we're not just talking about carbon emissions, we're talking about the land, the resources, everything that we need for all of our collective 8 billion lives, there's a huge gap. In fact, Oxfam has showed that the richest 1% in the world produce more than double the carbon emissions of the poorest 50%. So it isn't a case of the actual number of people, it is the case of the allocation of resources, and inequality is growing, it is not shrinking. So about 15 years ago, I first stepped on the carbon scale because I figured if I'm a climate scientist, I need to be looking at this. And I was really surprised, and again, this was 15 to 20 years ago, so it wasn't recent. I was surprised to find out that the biggest part of my personal footprint was flying. It was not flying to yoga retreats in Bali, never been to one of those. It was flying to scientific conferences and to talk to people about climate change. So back then, well before Zoom, well before the pandemic, I thought to myself, I have to do something about this. And so I decided I was going to transition 80% of the talks I gave to online talks. And this is back in the Skype days. So a lot of people said, well, we've never done that before. How would it work? But we worked through it, and I use interactive polling software, and I try to make sure we really do a good job. And the highest compliment I receive is when someone says, well, I wasn't even going to show up because it was just online. But it was as if she was in the room. It wasn't bad.
So you've reduced air travel.
Yes.
And even as you speak to us, you're here for a family visit, and so it's been bundled.
I only travel when I bundle. So I always bring together multiple events before I can get on a plane. But then, about 10 years ago, I sat down and I calculated it. I said, well, okay, so here are the changes I have made. And every year I adopt 2 new habits. I look at what we eat. I look at where we get our electricity from. I look at what cars we drive or how we can take public transportation.
Electric cars, hybrid cars.
Yes, I had a little plug-in hybrid because we didn't have charging stations where I lived in West Texas. And since it got taken out by a very large deer, the deer was fine, the car was not. Deer are large in Texas. Now I'm actually up in Carlos for a year, which has been very interesting and actually great. But I sat down and I calculated what would happen if everyone who had the resources I had did this. So make no mistake, it requires knowledge. You have to do the research. It's often harder to do the right thing than it is to do the wrong thing. Sometimes it's more expensive to do it.
Well, that's a huge deterrent.
Yes. And so I calculated that even if everybody who had the means to do so did it, that wouldn't even take care of a quarter of the problem. So then I knew there was something more we had to do, because a quarter of the problem is not enough. And I spoke to one of my colleagues, Stefan Rahmstorf in Germany. Stefan is an ocean scientist, and he is so dedicated to this that when he did his PhD in New Zealand in the 80s, I was just in high school then, I wasn't even thinking about climate change. He did not fly home to Germany one single time, not even to attend his sister's wedding, because he wouldn't step on a plane. But then he calculated that even if he did everything he couldn't cut his personal carbon footprint more than 50%. And he lives in Germany. He doesn't own a car. He bikes and takes trains. So that was when I realized there has to be something more we can do. And so I started to look at how has society changed before? We haven't had the vote for that long, relatively speaking. How do women get the vote? It was by using their voices for years and even decades, and they were not necessarily women of influence or power, and they certainly didn't have a vote at that time, but by using their voices year after year, we eventually changed society. How was civil rights enacted in the US? How did apartheid end in South Africa? How was gay marriage legalized? It never happened because the prime minister or the president just sort of woke up one morning and said, oh, we really should give women the vote and end civil rights, enact civil rights and allow gay marriage. No, it happened because people used their voices. That's what we need today.
We need to use our voices and act collectively, but we have to do something. So when people say to you, well, what should I do? What do you say?
My answer is this: do something, anything, and then talk about it, because that is how we make change contagious. Where you work, where you live, where you study. And don't talk about the polar bears and the ice sheets. Talk about what's happening where I live, talk about what we could do together to make a difference, and ask, why isn't our school doing that? Why isn't our Girl Guide troop doing this? Why isn't our neighborhood doing this? Why isn't our city doing this? That's number one. Number two is to look at where our money is. One of the most impactful things we can do as individuals is look at where we bank, where our retirement and our pension funds are invested in, where our credit cards are, and to write to those institutions and say, I don't want my money going into an industry that's causing this problem. Number three is to spark ideas where we work or where we study. Number four is to reach out to politicians, not only by voting, but, and we can do this so powerfully in Canada, I love that, but by actually having conversations with them. I was at my parents' house this summer and there was a knock on the door. I opened the door. It was our local MP. So we had a conversation about what more needs to be done about climate change, and he was wonderful. And then, lastly, make changes in our personal life. Look at, in Canada, we're very fortunate in that a lot of our hydro is renewable, but look at where we get our electricity, how we travel, what we eat, but then talk about it to make it
waste.
contagious.
I didn't realize food waste. You say if food waste were a country, it would be the third worst emitter.
Yeah, fourth worst now,
Fourth.
but yes. Isn't that insane? In Canada, we waste almost half the food we produce, and people are going hungry. I mean, in efficiency and energy, we waste over 60% of the energy we produce. It is just unreal. And so when people realize there's things we can do, just before the pandemic, I was actually speaking at a large church here in Southern Ontario, and I was talking about values, Christian, faith-based perspective on climate change, but I was also talking about how we can do anything and then talk about it. And so I gave examples, and food waste was one of them. And so I was standing at the door as people were leaving, eavesdropping, and I heard one woman say to the person she was with, she said, I've always been worried about climate change, but I never knew what to do. Now I know what to do. Food waste is such a huge problem, we're going to begin by eating the Christmas leftovers.
Well, it's starting somewhere. Do you see then lots more hopeful solutions that technology is going to improve things? I mean, getting rid of oil and gas driven cars, or what's the good news? People acting together and not as individuals?
It's all of the above. All of the above. Often we think of countries as sort of the biggest news, acting nationally, and we saw a lot of that at the recent climate conference. Then, of course, in Canada, we have a price on carbon, and the government recently announced a cap on emissions from our oil and gas sector, which is not only the biggest, but also the fastest growing sector in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions. And then we're looking at a further mandate on EVs here in Canada. But in Texas, we're seeing that over a third of the electricity in the state is now coming from wind and solar. It's the #1 wind and #1 solar producer in the country. They overtook California this year. Yeah. There are 5 different types of batteries currently being tested in Texas, from gravity batteries, where they raise up these big, big concrete blocks when wind is cheap. At night, it's almost negative in terms of the price. And then, when it's more expensive, they slowly drop them and generate the electricity. Or they're pumping compressed air into underground caverns. They're doing all kinds of crazy things to store the energy. But there's also amazing people working in the sports industry or the music industry or in art. My latest newsletter featured artists who are making a difference. There's children, including Robert from right here in Toronto, who have podcasts online sharing why we care about climate change. I love telling stories of people that we can identify that aren't like, famous, influential people. They're just ordinary people like us, like the guy who said, well, why don't I start a climate committee for my homeowners association? What a concept. I love that idea. So it turns out that nature could help with up to 1/3 of the solutions we need, like greening low-income neighborhoods. So nature is so low-tech, it's incredible. We've had the technology of photosynthesis around for billions of years, but we aren't using it the way we could. So low-income neighborhoods here in Canada as well as in the US can be up to 6 or 7 degrees Celsius hotter during a heat wave than a wealthier neighborhood with tree cover and green space. They are much more likely to flood. They are much more exposed to air pollution. When you green those low-income neighborhoods, first of all, you're helping to cool them down during heat waves. And even here in Canada, our cities are getting quite hot in the summer. You're also providing flood protection because green areas take up water. The trees filter the air pollution. Spending time outside in nature, it's so good for our physical and our mental health. Like, count the wins: physical health, mental health, flood protection, air pollution protection, heat protection. Oh, and growing all those things takes up carbon from the atmosphere. I mean, the solutions that nature has for us are just absolutely mind-boggling, from restoring coastal wetlands to protect from coastal storms, to the incredible rainforests that we have along our coast out in BC, which you call the Emerald Edge, working with First Nations people to become guardians of those forests, to protect them, to keep the carbon there instead of in the atmosphere where we don't want it. I mean, you can tell, I could talk about solutions all day.
And I guess it just does still utterly energize you to be part of this movement, this fight, this existential battle.
I feel like what I'm fighting for is not to end the climate crisis. I'm fighting for a better future. And don't we all want that?
Well, so many kids you hear these days suffer from serious climate anxiety. I mean, it's a real worry, and they look at our generation and go, how did you mess things up so badly, and what future is there for us?
Around the world, 85% of young people are worried about climate change. When they're asked how they feel, the number one answer, I think, is sad. Worried, anxious, paralyzed. The people I speak with, of all ages, 90 to 95% say that they are depressed, anxious, angry, frustrated. And what we have to realize is, first of all, if you feel that way, you're not alone. The majority of people now feel that way, and that's part of why we're not talking about it. Because who wants to talk about something that makes you angry, frustrated, and depressed, but you don't know what to do about it? The second thing that I want people to know is, if you feel that way, that is a rational response to what's happening. It is not a mental health condition. It is not some type of syndrome. You are not too sensitive. You understand what's at stake. You understand that our future is what's at stake. And I think we should all be worried about that and anxious about that and frustrated by the slow pace of the action. But the third thing that we need to know is that each of us has the ability to make a difference. Each of our voices truly can affect change.
So what do you think of Greta Thunberg?
I think that she understands what's at stake, and she understands that, as she said, I may be small, but I can make a difference. I love that. We may be small, but every single one of us can make a difference. And if you look back in history at the people who've made a difference, we know some of their names. We know the Martin Luther King Jr.'s. We know the Susan B. Anthony's. We know the William Wilberforce's. But do we remember the thousands and even millions of people who shared their vision, who advocated beside them, who marched behind them? We don't, but we live in their shadow today. Our lives are different because they used their voices.
The final question we ask on this show is what does being Canadian mean to you?
Being Canadian means that we understand that we're part of this planet. There are no walls around our country that go up to the top of the atmosphere. We have the privilege to live in this incredible country that stretches from sea to sea, that welcomes people from all around the world, that welcomed my own ancestors, coming from Ukraine, coming from England, coming from Ireland, that welcomes people today, but that cannot continue to be a safe harbor in the future if we don't tackle the climate crisis. So again, it's not about tackling the climate crisis for the sake of fixing that problem. It's about fighting for a better future for all of us, and this is the hurdle we have to get over to get there.
You're amazing. Good for you. A pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll be back next week with another episode of Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of Earl and Janice Oborn, as well as the following donors: Ted and Alice Kernahan, Tony and Sherry Fell, Mary Davey, the Browning Watt Foundation, David and Cheryl Carr, Bryce and Nikki Douglas, Richard Wernham and Julia West, Michael McCain and family, the Linwood Family Foundation, Steve and Catherine Coxford, Richard Pilosoff, Clinch House Foundation, the 63 Foundation, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association,